right now I'm getting distracted. This is my frog tank behind me. If you see, there's one frog sitting on that, and then there's another frog inside the tire swing. My name's Paul. I'm working on this piece for Arts and Above, and it's based around a dance performance that's going to have the dancers. Some of them, as I understand, I don't have a full picture. I don't know if the choreography is done. There's going to be a center stage at Westside Theater in Missoula, Montana, and there's going to be a motor, I think, on the left-hand side of the stage, which gives me an interesting opportunity as a musician to try to work with that, because it's going to be a very loud motor, but it's going to be recycling and pulling a rope, and the dancers will be, some of them, I think, moving on the rope, and they go alternate while other dancers are doing other things too. It's kind of a prop that's a build around for the theme, which I believe is about the flow of life and the fact that you don't get to decide the flow completely, but you decide what you do with it, and you interact with the flow, but the flow is like a motor. So I called it our motor marches on like Time Zero marches on. Maybe it should just be Time Zero. I don't know. But the interesting part is right now we still don't know if we're going to be able to mute the motor. I've talked to a few friends about how we can maybe sound pad the motor as much as possible, but we're still planning for it to be a theme, whether it's loud or whether it's softened. I think it will play a part. So I did create a few backing motor tracks that I think they're going to rehearse with, and then where it's just the motor but we warped it, maybe we'll work that into the songs. With this one I decided to try having the motor running, like turning on at the start of the song, warping into the opening chords of the song, so that it kind of fades out in that way, and then the final chord of the song will also warp back into the motor, and then it'll turn off, which I thought was a kind of cool idea if every song does that. So they end up looping into each other through the sound of the motor as a consistent theme that pieces each one together. That's the vision I have for it. So I'll start with just the track itself, and we're going to break it down into the aesthetic choices, the artistic decisions. Then we'll break it down into more technical, like the mixing and mastering chains that are used to achieve the results. And then we'll break it down even further into the compositional choices that were made. Sweet, let's dive in. We're gonna listen to the track. I got my leopard gecko in front of me. So that's that. I think it sounds pretty cool. Let's break it down by kind of artistic ideas, I guess. So the first obvious one is, I guess, the motor, which almost sounds like a saw or like a lawnmower or something. We'll do the technical next of how we achieve the sound, but right now why we achieve the sound. So the concept is, if we've got this motor running, I was even thinking it would be cool if as the motor fades out, somehow we could put the dampener onto the motor in that exact time, so that as it softens in the song, it also softens in reality. Maybe the motor's running before the performance even starts, so the audience is already curious, and then somebody comes out and puts the dampener over the motor, and as it dampens, it turns into this almost psychedelic kind of dreamscape where we're kind of, I guess, exiting out of what is normal conventional reality as a view and entering into an imaginative view, like symbolically and also in action. We're exiting that just being a motor, and we're entering this motor being more than that, by it becoming a song, it becoming a piece, it becoming an expression, rather than just a physical motor running. So I think that would be a cool concept. I don't entirely know if it's going to be possible. It really depends on if we can mute the motor or not. So either way, it serves a purpose. If we can't mute the motor, then it will become part of the pieces, which is a little concerning. So we're hoping to mute the motor. That's kind of this whole part. It almost sounds Willy Wonka. When Roald Dahl wrote Willy Wonka, he intended Willy Wonka to be God, which is kind of a crazy, if you ever want to Google it, rabbit hole you can go down. But he was thinking that God kind of created all these things, all the like candy that we can use responsibly or irresponsibly, and he progressively gets characterized worse. But in the first book, he's kind of a virtuistic character. Anyways, altruistic, I meant character. Anyways, there goes the ADD again. To me, adding the jazz chords and then the trumpet takes the weight off of the concept of that previous concept, that almost Willy Wonka-like uncertainty of us entering into this fantasy world where this is not a motor, this is something symbolizing bigger things, and that has an edge to it. And then to lighten that, because I think that's part of the whole journey, right, is learning to take it a little less seriously, make it into a dance, make life into a dance, make it into jazz, improvisation jazz, right? So that's where I guess I thought it would fly really well to have it go straight from that into the chords and the trumpet. That's just the appropriate time for drums to come in. I won't get too pretentious about any of that. It's building. It's building to a thesis statement. It's kind of almost similar to an essay. How we've got our first statement, right, which is that first melody, and then we've got a reiteration of it, but adding the bass, which I guess would be the second statement, into a alternate melody that builds into the chorus, which I suppose would be our true thesis of our essay here, which comes here. And so there's a few things happening there. It's got a certain kind of nefariousness to it, but it's also very pretty. And then it almost goes into this full big band, Frank Sinatra kind of thing. When it starts going, doing the crazy frills and stuff. There is an element of it that reminds me of a Welcome to the Machine kind of vibe. Kind of like entering the chocolate factory, but the chocolate factory is like an industrial complex. That kind of is a reflection of modern day life. There's a give and take happening within the pole of the motor. And there's something about it that feels both unnerving and also exciting and also repetitive but fresh. You know, it's a duality. So we can skip on ahead a little bit because the theme returns. The next big change that happens is here. That's a moment where I guess the chords really can shine, the drums can shine, it gets more sparse and more introspective as we move back to the beat. The reflection time, which proportionally to the piece is much lower than the time in the factory, right? 8-hour allotted sleep before you go back to work, and the motor pulls you forward. This is, I guess, that calm before the storm, the reflection. The piece isn't meant to be drawing a conclusion, it's more making a statement. This actually in a really weird way is like the Icarus flight of the trumpet, because it's a little bit defiant in the sense that once it slows down to reflect, there's almost this building fight that happens within the trumpet melody where it's kind of building up in a longing way before exiting the piece entirely and being replaced by the motor. So I mean, there's a little bit of a... This is the saw, by the way, essentially, or the motor. Unnerving is this process right here. Wiped out, I don't know, the trumpet, I guess. It goes down an octave and plays hints towards the melody, but beyond that, it's gone. You can derive what you want from it. It's obviously kind of the climax is when the melody moves from the trumpet onto the motor. The motor replaces the trumpet. Obviously, each piece is working within the theme of having a motor. To me, in this one, maybe the motor is a little bit of a Willy Wonka in some ways, but it's also the march of the machine. So here it returns to that Willy Wonka, that's that altering of the motor, and then it's going to go back to the motor and turn off. And with that, we'll end this section and move to the technical section. Effects that were used, some of the plug-in chains, then after that, some of the process of composing. The fact, I don't know why, the audio that Kate sent me of the motor kind of glitches out right at the end. I just want to say that was not planned. That's sick, though. I was like, oh yeah, that's awesome. So this is kind of a cool video. It's a little educational too. So if you like the mix and you're a musician, I want to give the opportunity that you could actually kind of replicate some of the things you like. The mix is where I spend most of my time. In the score and warping sounds with plugins, and then obviously creating the chain and then setting the volumes. So there's a lot to do in here. As a general guideline, I think this is actually really useful, at least if you're making hip hop or EDM kind of style beats. So you're gonna want your like organs and chords and pianos -14. And again, vague rule, right? Your bass, -10. Your pads, you're gonna want to hit about -12. With your lead instrument or vocal, -6. With your 808 or your sub bass, -6. With your snare, -6. Those are your three big boys. Those are driving the track. Really, honestly, anything that's harmonizing with the lead is really dependent. Somewhere between -18 and -10, I think, is fair, depending on the harmony. Solos, you can totally hit -6 in a solo, especially in EDM. You can really, honestly, you sometimes don't even have vocals. Cymbals, -14, so kind of similar to your organs and pianos for reference points. Your kick drum isn't as loud as your sub bass or your 808. It's usually going to hit around -8. Toms, I like to sit at like -10. I think that covers all the volume settings, which is a big part of mixing. For the motor, I just left it plain. That's the intro and the outro, right? And then with this, I just threw a guitar rig on it. There's a lot of rhythmic samples, which is what I went under, characters. I found this beat arpeggiator, which is kind of interesting to use it on the motor, especially because it pitches the sound. I set it to G sharp, just because that's the chord. That's not even the key of the song. The song is an E flat, so E flat major, relative minor of C minor. It switches between E flat and then that relative minor is a major, so E flat and C major. It switches between those two keys. It creates a little bit of a unique jazzy sound to an otherwise kind of pop influenced melody. So that's the note, and then G sharp. I want to choose a note that's not going to be like the root note of the chord, right? So here we've got a pad. We're using a neutron. Inside my neutrons, I always have exciters, compressors. They range, depending on the instrument, between a ratio of 2:1 to 3:1, and I think one instrument I used a 4:1. The release and attack are always ranging. The threshold, on most instruments, I'm trying to hit a -1 or a -2, maybe a -3. The exciter, this side, to me, is soft and smooth. This is more gritty. These are high end, these are low end. So since this is a high end pad and I wanted it to be a little bit not smooth, a little bit more grit, I went with the tape. A piano, maybe I'd go retro. Stand-up bass, I'd go warm. And if it's a distorted synth bass, I'd go tube. Keep it low in the mix, like 10%, just to add some thickness. The equalizer is gonna, again, depend on the instrument a lot. High pass, which is just gonna kill all frequencies below it. On a pad, here, what have we got it at? 80. Oftentimes I think 80 is probably appropriate for a lot of instruments. You might go up to 100, like a bass guitar, maybe 40, and sub or 808 or whatever, I'd put around 20. Most of the time you're killing mud, actually. On chords, you might want to lower the melody. This is the frequency where we hear melody. It's also, if something's grating, you probably want to turn this frequency down. This is like the 3000 frequencies. But obviously on melodic instruments, I'll be turning that up. I like to turn up the highs, but especially on chords, a little bit on melodies, obviously never on a bass instrument. That's just another exciter. I'm a little bit crazy in that way. Let's see what we did here. These are actually pretty strong settings. As you can see, the amount is very low, but it's kind of high in the mix for a lot of things. But I do like it. It really does make it sound full. This chorus, I guess depending on the instrument, you're going to want to do different things, mostly with the rate and the depth. Like a bassy instrument, you're going to have a lower rate and a lower depth, and probably also lower in the mix. Reverb's going to really change depending on the instrument, especially how much the instrument already has a built-in reverb. In this case, this is very wet for me. I don't usually keep it there. I usually would have it at like 8% for a lot of instruments. In my opinion, this reverb has way too many settings. I don't like having all these options. It's just bad for my OCD. Rear shape, I usually have higher than attack shape. Pre-delay, if you do that too much, it'll sound really fucked up. You want to keep that at a reasonable rate. 45 is even, that's pretty good. Size, keep it, I don't love to have huge reverbs because I like to have moving melodies that are doing a lot. But if you're just holding a note, you could get a lot crazier with some of these. Like that's the decay. It's called time, but it's really the decay. The real things that you need in a reverb are just wet to dry percent, decay, and pre-delay. Those are the three most important. And then we have all these others. What other plugins do I use on this track? The Maxim. This thing's pretty sweet. This is basically just like our maximizer, right? We're going to set a threshold where we're getting a desired attenuation, which is really just gain reduction, right? And ceiling -1, kind of just like on the master. Release kind of depends. That part depends a little bit on the instrument. But the threshold here, we're usually trying to hit like an attenuation of like -2, -4. We're never really going much higher than that. The trumpet, I think, has a maximum. Yeah, it does. You see. And there, I think I was letting it hit -6 because it's just, there's so much dynamic range in a melodic instrument. But obviously with a bass drum, you can just pretty much solidly hit it -2 over and over. The isotope trash, this is kind of notable. Seems like overkill to use it the way that I'm using it most of the time. I do kind of care that it's a tube distortion. I'm just trying to get my drive, which I turn way lower than they have at the preset. I'm just adding like 10%. And in the mix, this is fairly high. Usually I've got it around here, like a 5 or 10% in the mix, just to add a little bit, kind of like an exciter, you know, a little bit of thickness. I do like this ozone delay. The only things you really need are time. It's nice to have two, one for each ear. You want time, feedback, and then wet percent. This one has filters, which I ended up using, ironically, but that's not necessarily needed. I don't even know what panic does. I'm not hitting that. Wide. Don't need that. Don't need it. Trash. Not going to distort my echo. I love Isotope. Great company. It's a lot of fun creatively, but if you're actually trying to get a great mix, it's an aesthetic choice at that point. But these are important. I like to do, in this case, a dotted 16th. When I had this at the original settings, I thought it ended up sounding kind of blurry. So usually I would have a dotted 1/8 and a 1/4, but since it sounded blurry, I decided let's go a 1/8 note and a dotted 16th. And as you can see, because it was sounding blurry, I set it really low, 2%, 3%. On other instruments, maybe 10% would be fine. Even up to a 15%, that's pretty crazy though. 8% is usually pretty solid, 7 even. So, feedback, I usually keep it pretty low. This is even lower than I usually would keep it. 20%, 10%, depending on the instrument, are good settings. I think that kind of covers all the plugins. We can kind of go on which ones I use. Yeah, so on this trumpet within the plugin here, I actually had to just create different trumpets with different mixes within and masters within and reverbs within the plugin because I liked most of the time the reverbs within the plugin more than the reverbs I had available within my plugins, just because these are already kind of mixing into the trumpet organically, built for the plugin itself. While I was doing that, I also was changing the articulation on each one. Probably something you could, in theory, automate, right? Like you'd automate a volume change. You could probably automate an articulation change. I just didn't want to do it. So I created different ones, and that way I could also accentuate different sounds. I don't like sustain necessarily. That sounds like a really MIDI trumpet. I mean, it's really obvious. The rip is when it goes, and that's pretty cool. I use that. Grace note I didn't use. Shake is that, you hear that on the chorus. But like I said, I changed all the settings for each one. This one's a soft sustain. And within each of those, I chose different settings, and that was just pretty aesthetic. And then beyond that, I just added, within the neutron, the things we discussed, an equalizer and a compressor, the isotope trash to add fullness, the air. I turned these off because I didn't need delay or reverb because I had it within there. And then a maxim, just because sometimes those trumpets were hitting these notes that were like 6 decibels louder. Like I said, that's one where I allowed a -6. I know this is really in depth. I don't know. I've never made a video like this, so I'm not sure if it's useful for you guys. Within the Butch Vig drums, I actually had to go in and do a little bit of math. I have a video of that I'll insert while I was doing it. But okay, here's like a hi-hat. Let's set this to -14, right? coming in at negative 26, plus 10, that's negative 16. We need it to come up by like 2 decibels. You feel me? Still coming in pretty quiet. See that, but now it's too far. It's negative 10, so we go back down. So negative 24, that's perfect. Plus 10 is negative 14. And we got to do it to the next one and the next one, right? We got to get the ride. And that's how I mix with the Butch Vig drums. It's all pain in the butt, because it is worth it. Because it's a big pain in the butt. These are awesome drums. If you don't know Butch Vig, he worked on Nirvana. But these are actually, I believe, him playing the drums and then warping them into a drum machine. It's a super sweet, and it was super cheap when I got it, at least. But it is pretty funny. There's a lot of weird shit you can do with it. They're like warped and grungy, and they just kind of slap. Doesn't do the mixing for you, which is pretty funny considering his role as a producer himself and a mixer himself. For hip-hop, rock, EDM, pop, it's all kind of similar. For hip-hop, which is what I try to do with songs like this, I could also look at it like EDM. I kind of switch between the two. But kick, you'll have it negative 8. Snare, you'll have it negative 6. Hi-hats and cymbals, these vary. Sometimes people put like a ride at negative 16 or a crash at negative 16. I put them all at negative 14 personally. And this is relative, right? So you can turn them all down. But yeah, with Butch Vig drums, you're going to have to go in, click on each one, and set the volume. See, I've got a mix so that they're all hitting the same. See, but it wasn't like that. The snares were all different volumes, and the hi-hats were all different volumes. For the thump that you hear in the song, instead of the 808, I went ahead and I used this massive, wow. This thing is massive. It really slows the computer down. I warped it slightly just to make it even more bassy. This is an unusual equalizer formation that you'd really only use on a bass that's filling the role of an 808. And the compressor is actually pretty generic. Isotope, trash, the settings are kind of ridiculously nonchalant. Oh, it's actually pretty high. Yo, because I used a smooth distortion. It sounds good though. Here it is isolated. And when you put it with the drum, and then I mixed the bass alongside that. And so with the bass, I used a slap bass sound. I added a little bit of chorus, a little bit, again, of grit, just to thicken it. For reference, this is a more normal bass EQ. So that kind of shows how strange that sub bass EQ is. This adds into the bass, playing it up high, which is kind of interesting, but only on the chorus. It's almost blurred out by some of the other things going on, but I think that's actually really cool. Used a kind of tinny sound, as you can see, and I EQ'd it and added some chorus and stuff. The piano part is crazy if you hear it in the left ear. Let's just go ahead and look at the score for that. That was kind of wild. Wild, right? It sounds like it's non-melodic. It's that key change makes it sound non-melodic when isolated, but when you hear the chords behind it, it's just that right about here, you can tell from the way that the thing's not handling the notes well. It's having to put lots of naturals and stuff. That's where it changes to be in C major rather than E flat major. I like this little redux thing. It's a very thin sounding little synth going on. So in the other ear, And it's amplified, of course, by the distortion from the exciter. The neutron is doing some EQ work, and then obviously we got that air chorus too. So those two together is interesting. So they're on each opposite ear. Doi! That's this one. For this particular articulation, I actually used a distortion delay, no reverb, and then I added my delay because I was using that distorted delay, and I was doing dotted, or whatever they're called, doits. Doit. It's kind of cool when you hear it isolated. Then in context, so when you hear that in that setting, you see how the different treatments are kind of making it a little bit more engaging. That's most of the instruments, believe it or not. The other two instruments, actually, these last ones are kind of this little sparkle that we put on the top. And one is this weird thing. It almost sounds like Mario. You'd barely even notice it in the mix. It just happens at that one part on the chorus. Very subtle stuff. And then this one, that's our motor. We have a whole host of treatments on this thing. Over here, I actually just took a lot of the treatment off in order for it to play the melody at the end, which is right here. And now I just went over all the plugins, so I'll go ahead and put you back to the correct timeline here. I just had to, I made sure to put the volumes first because that's sometimes one of the most interesting reference points that's universally helpful. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should include in this video. I don't think so. I think we're done. That's mixing. We're done mixing. And this one has even more echo, which allows it to, at the end, blend into the real motor. Check this. I think that's about it, you guys. I think I'm sharing all my secrets with you on this track, at least. I've got a bus sending everything to either 3 and 4 or 1 and 2. So like the drums are going to 1 and 2. Whereas basically everything else is going to 3 to 4. And that's just doing a little bit of work before we even get to the master. I'm already doing a little bit. So like the drums, I know this looks crazy, but here's what's actually happening. So we're compressing it slightly. We're cutting out some highs, basically leaving the bass alone. And then we're keeping that so quiet in the mix. It's just adding a little bit of depth. And then over here, we're doing the same thing with the melodic instruments. As you can see, the volume's not very high. You'll see that it feels fuller because it's just, this one's only adding compression, that's it. And then if you turn it up too loud, it just sounds worse. And if you turn it all the way off, it sounds worse. So you find that middle way. That's the trick with that. Yeah, and that kind of concludes, I think, the technical end of it. So I think we can move on to mastering. I'm mastering it like a hip-hop master. So the equalizer doesn't really need to be crazy, you know? I just wanted to bump a little bit of my, what would be the 808 frequency, but in my case, I'm using a synth. Here we're just removing a little mud. There's nothing happening here, raising a little air. I mean, I used to do different mastering techniques, slightly different on different parts of the song. That's such a mistake. You basically want to keep it as simple as possible. And just, for me, one track, obviously. Like I said, it used to be more than that. You could automate it if you have to. I never have had to. Try to take care of that stuff in the mix. A very simple equalizer setup. This master is actually just serving as a clipper. I just go to the loud part, which is right here. Basically, as I move the threshold with the transient set, I want to have it just barely hit -1, -2 on those kicks. It's like perfect. It's awesome. So we got that ozone there. We had another ozone here. This one we want to add an exciter. This is really subtle stuff. As you can see, as we go up, we add a little bit more grit and harmonics, and try to keep the mix about equal with all of them. I don't want to mess anything up, just trying to spice it, you know? I'm not trying to then fuck it up. Imager, I like to cut it so it's like cuts off bass at 120, cuts off low mids at 1,000, cuts off high mids at 6,000, and leaves highs from everything onward. You leave the bass as centered as you can. You add 10 to the low mids, 20 to the high mids, and then 30 to the highs. And then with the maximizer, this is the funnest part. You want your threshold, again, at the peaks. You want to be hitting -2 to -4, -3. Things like that are good numbers to see here. But what's really interesting to me is figuring out the character, the stereo independence, and the transient emphasis. Because this part's kind of intuitive. Here you want between in the 20s to the 30s. You could even go up to 40. Here, kind of very similar with the others, 20 to 40 on a hip hop on all of these, essentially. This one, I think, is more like a 2 to 3. Here, again, we're going to move that threshold. So this part's fun. Do it with me. Numbers look good. See, I like the character there. It starts to get muddy there. See, that character, it could even go there. We just don't want it much, we don't want it much slower than that. That sounds good. Now let's do it again. Let's do it with the transient. It's really subtle stuff, which is part of the fun. But really, honestly, when it got into the threes, it got muddy. You know, because it's moving too slow. Same with the transients. If I go up into the 40%, it starts to get a little muddy. Same with the emphasis, but I kind of landed here. But I'm going to edit it some more, so do it with me. Yeah, on one of the songs on the album, I got away with a 40% transient. That's kind of crazy. I think that was the first one, Choices. That's the first one I did. 40% sounded awesome there. I think I'm pushing it at 30% here. You kind of can hear what it's doing. See, that's too low to me. But if I did something like this, it's getting nasty. Oh, ridiculous. I like that, man. I like that. What I like about this part is this one's not a science. You have to use your ear. A lot of this stuff ends up becoming a science once you really get the hang of it. So let's try to make sure that we're hitting the -4, -3, -2. As the lower we go, the more distortion we might hear. You could hit a -5 if it's once. The compression will sound more professional, so it'll not only kick on your CD more, it'll also kick on Spotify more. Awesome. And that's the loudest section of our song. So when you want to do this part, basically just go to where it's going to be the loudest. I'll show you a couple of quick things that we're going to do just to check it. Ozone's interesting. It'll start you off on the RMS and peak, but I'm more usually going to momentary. No, not momentary, sorry, short term and integrated. Integrated is what Spotify cares about. It will turn it up or down to -14. You definitely don't want it to be turning it up. That'll add distortion. Spotify doesn't have a great quiet gain. You do want it to be turning you down, actually, because you'll still retain some thickness and volume in reality. And short term is kind of the more standard way to look at your LUFS per section. At our height of our sections, we're hoping to hit a -9 or higher. It'd be cool if we're hitting -8. That's kind of a hip hop standby to be hitting. I think pop is happy at -9, wants to be at -8, and EDM can even push -6 or -7 if it's crazy enough. We're gonna look at the loudest parts of the song. Woo! Damn! That feels good. So it's like crazy to see those numbers, right? And anybody who does mixing knows exactly how good that feels when you do everything right. You set the thing, the appropriate level. You know, you want to be minusing 2 or 3 on the hits. You don't want to be having to -6 or 7 and have it distort to get to that LUFS. Anybody who has done this before a little bit knows how good it feels and how hard it is to get your mixes to that level, to get your master and your chain down to the point where you are doing that effortlessly without distorting the track. You still like the sound and you're hitting professional volume levels, professional sound. Just for anybody who's not sure, this is the mix going in, I believe, and this is the master. And we did set our ceiling at -1, so yeah, our ceiling's -1. This is the LUFS that matters right here. Right now we're doing momentary. Let's go! Nice, so there's dynamics naturally. That's why, like I said, you don't really want to have it flipping between mastering chains to try to get the verse quieter than the chorus. And you don't really want to be doing that, you guys. You don't need to be doing anything crazy. This creates consistency if you have the same chain throughout, like this. See, we're not hitting -7 the whole time. That's good. Gives it somewhere to go. Perfect. It's already hitting different numbers throughout. And once it gets to that chorus, we're going to be seeing -7 coming in. It's building naturally. We saw -11. Now we're seeing -9s. We're already seeing a little bit of 8s, which is wild in a section like this. It's not even hot yet, and now it goes hot. This is where we're seeing it start to hit 7s. That's wild. That's so powerful. Wow. No distortion. I hear none. Crazy. That feels good. Now the last one I won't make you sit through. I'm just going to show you how to do it. So we switch from short term to integrated, which is going to show us the overall volume of the song itself. I'm sure we will be plenty louder than -14. We're already hitting the numbers that a professional track wants to hit on the chorus. We have a little dynamics. I think it'll probably land right in the professional area. Let's see. So we got all that video done, and the frog's still sitting right where he's been sitting. They're nocturnal, that's why he's probably sleeping, which I'm about to go do. So thanks for watching the video. Like and subscribe below. Give us a follow if you want to see more content. I'm doing all sorts of content. Sometimes it's comedy. Sometimes it's reaction videos. Sometimes we're breaking down projects that we're doing. So stay tuned.